Good evening, and welcome to my GSTR 410 presentation entitled Gang Culture, a Response to Economic Modernization. This is a presentation by me, John Ludwig, and in this presentation, we will be examining the similarities between the Yakuza in Japan and African-American gang culture in America. So first, let's start with my research question. My research question is gang culture an invented tradition created in response to compressed economic modernization? And as I mentioned before, we will be examining this by comparing the Yakuza in Japan to African-American gang culture in America. So before we begin, we need to define some key terminology. The first word here is tradition, and what tradition represents is the sense of the past, what is handed down to us from the past, whether it is customs or a set of beliefs. Tradition represents the past and what is handed down from the past. In addition, tradition represents the lack of ability to make choices and centers more on people as opposed to materialistic items. The second term we have here is modernity. And what modernity represents is the ongoing sense of the present and the future. Modernity is characterized by individualism and the freedom or the ability to make choices. Unlike tradition, it is not concerned with groups or societies. Modernity is really concerned with the individual. Invented traditions are a set of customs or beliefs that are created in order to appear traditional or simulate the effects of tradition in order to attempt to establish continuity with a suitable historical past. That is what invented tradition is. And the final term we have here is compressed modernity. And compressed modernity occurs when modernity occurs in an extremely short period of time, such as a few generations or a few decades. So let's look at a brief timeline of African Americans in America before World War II. Around 1619 is when slavery begins, and this is where Africans are bought and sold on the market in the United States. However, slavery begins by individuals going to the west coast of Africa, kidnapping people and bringing them across the ocean on a voyage known as the Middle Passage to what is now considered the Caribbean islands, at the time was considered the West Indies. And then the slaves would go from the Caribbean to various ports in the southern United States, and then these slaves were auctioned off and sold. And this was occurring around 1619, and as you see, continues to occur until the mid-1860s. In 1861, the Civil War begins, which some people will say is in response to states' rights, but really it's about states' rights to slavery. So it really is a combination of the two, at least I would say. 2 years after the beginning of the Civil War, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which is a step in the right direction to eliminating slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation itself doesn't outlaw slavery. That doesn't happen until 1865, when slavery is formally abolished due to the 13th Amendment, which effectively outlawed slavery. So, in a period of about 245 years, you have individuals being kidnapped from Africa, brought to America and sold into labor, to finally being what some would consider free. Although, as we quickly will discover, the abolishment of slavery doesn't necessarily mean that African Americans are free. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we start seeing something known as the Jim Crow laws, which are laws that are implemented and put into place in order to keep African Americans down for lack of a better word. So here is where you really see African Americans and their lack of ability to make choices and their lack of ability to be free despite the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. You know, African Americans couldn't go to the same schools, couldn't drink out of the same water fountains as their white colleagues. And what this really does is it really shows that that the Jim Crow laws itself could have been an invented tradition in response to the compressed modernization of African Americans, in the sense of them going from being slaves to being free in less than 250 years. However, we'll proceed. So after the emergence of the Jim Crow laws and African Americans continuingly to be kept down, you start to see an outflow of African Americans from the South to the northern and Midwestern cities of the United States. And we really start seeing this begin in 1916. And this migration is called the Great Migration. Well, the first Great Migration. Where, as I mentioned before, African Americans are leaving the southeastern United States to seek more economic opportunities in northern cities, such as New York and Philadelphia, or Midwestern cities, such as Chicago. And we continue to see the Great Migration even into the Roaring 20s, where the United States was entering a period of economic prosperity. However, in 1929, this would come to an end, and it would mark the beginning of the Great Depression, which would last from about 1929 to about the early 1940s. And here, I say it ends in 1945, but that's also when World War II ends. And what happened was World War II was really the economic catalyst that was able to get us out of the Great Depression. Of course, you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal acts, which greatly benefited African Americans in the Northeast and Midwest as well. But you see the end of World War II, or the beginning of the United States' involvement in World War II as the end of the Great Depression. And this is a timeline, again, of African Americans for probably their first 340 some odd years of existence in the United States. So continuing along this timeline, we continue to see compressed modernity in Black America today. So as I mentioned before, in 1945, World War II ends. But as World War II is ending, we see that there is a second Great Migration that starts in 1940 and ends in about 1970, which is when African Americans are continuing to leave the South, but are not really settling in northern and Midwestern cities. They're settling in other cities in the Southwest and in the Western United States, in places such as Arizona and California. Around 1950 is where we start to see suburbanization begin, which you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with African Americans in Black America? It actually has a lot to do with them. And the reason for that is because when veterans were returning home from the Second World War, they no longer desired the city life. So you started seeing a lot of veterans from the Second World War and other upper class citizens leaving the cities into places called suburbs, which suburbs are essentially places that aren't necessarily cities themselves, but are within close commuting distances to the cities. So essentially in suburbs, you get to experience city life without actually being in the city. So a lot of World War II vets and wealthy citizens left the cities and began moving to the suburbs, mostly because they didn't desire city life, but at the same time, they also wanted to get away from the increasing number of African Americans that were migrating into these cities from the southeastern United States. And as suburbanization is happening, we also see economic expansion occurring in the wake of World War II, where the United States really not only has solidified itself as a global power, but also begins to continue to integrate with the rest of the world. So that's, that combined with suburbanization, we really start to see a rise in urban decay in cities, because all of the wealthy, affluent white citizens are leaving for the suburbs. They're also taking the money with them. So that leads to a scarcity of resources in urban America and the start of urban decay. And again, as all of this is happening, we see the beginning and the end of the civil rights movement, which begins in about 1954 and lasts until about 1968. And in the civil rights movement, African Americans were fighting for equality in the United States and were attempting to put a stop to the segregation and the Jim Crow laws. And unfortunately, as much as the civil rights movement helped progress and advance African Americans, unfortunately, it wasn't enough for them. And as compressed modernity continues to take hold, we'll see that African Americans were not only left out of tradition or the traditional United States, but also within their own compressed modernity. And in the bigger context, the compressed modernity of the United States, many African Americans were still left out. So now that we kind of have a timeline of African American history in America and how the African American experience could be considered compressed modernity, now we're going to discuss Japan and Japanese compressed modernity. So here is a timeline of Japan prior to World War II. In 1868 to 1912, we have the Meiji period. And again, forgive me if I mispronounce the words. I'll try my best not to, but don't let it take away from the deeper meaning of what I'm attempting to communicate. So in the Meiji period, we really begin to see a rise in Japan's imperialism and their desire to strengthen their military. And the reason for this is because Japan really wanted to be able to compete with its Western counterparts. So we really start to see Japan begin to develop its military and begin its imperialistic rise in order to be able to compete with its Western colleagues. And the Meiji period is also where the Emperor of Japan had relocated the capital to Edo, which eventually would become Tokyo. So in 1868, this is really the beginning of compressed modernity in Japan. And I would even break compressed modernity down into two parts in Japan. And from 1868 to about 1945 is this first wave of compressed modernity, so to speak. So after the Meiji period concludes in 1912, we have the Taisho period, which begins in 1912 and ends in 1926. And in the Taisho period is where we see Japan enter World War I and really start to become more integrated on a global stage. So Japan essentially increased its investments in its democratic institutions. In addition, Japan signs the Treaty of Versailles, which allows it to become much more integrated globally. And also Japan Japan received some colonies from Germany in the Pacific as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So that's really the beginning of, I guess, what would be considered Japan's imperialistic expansion. But this really doesn't begin until 1926, which is the start of the Showa period. In 1926 to 1945 is going to be our main focus for this period in time. So beginning in 1926, we really start to see Japan see a rise in nationalism and also a rise in expansionist wars. And this is where Japan really begins to start building its empire. And, Japan continues to do this until World War II. And Japan, being involved in World War II, attempted to defend its empire through this expansion. However, in 1945, World War II ended and Japan's expansion ceased. And something I want to mention before we move on is that Japan's expansion, obviously, we could say it began with the acquisition of the colonies from Britain. However, Japan was lacking a lot of natural resources such as oil or coal. And in order for Japan to have these resources, they wanted to expand and take over different territories. So that way Japan could be self-sufficient, so to speak, in obtaining its own natural resources, which is something that Japan doesn't have a lot of. So yes, these expansionist wars were essentially ways for Japan to acquire resources in order to become self-sufficient. But all of that comes to an end in World War II, or in 1945 upon the conclusion of World War II. So here's the second wave. Here's a timeline of the second wave of compressed modernity in Japan, which really occurs post-World War II. So as we mentioned earlier, World War II ends for Japan in 1945. From 1950 to 1965, we see Japan investing heavily in its energy sector. And as I mentioned before, Japan was attempting to expand in order to obtain as many natural resources as it can in order to become self-sufficient. So when these colonies and these resources got taken away from Japan, Japan needed to switch gears a little bit, so to speak, and Japan started investing heavily into its energy sector in order to supplement the lack of resources it had had when it lost those colonies. In 1955 to about 1975, although this is something I would consider ongoing, Japan really invests heavily in its post-war education system. And what this does is this allows Japan's future workforce to become highly educated and highly skilled. And when you have a highly skilled and highly educated workforce, you really are allowed to help catapult yourself into the economic stratosphere and really be able to increase productivity, which is exactly what happens in the 1960s as Japan really continues to globalize. So in the 1960s, Japan begins to open up to international competition with some of its own sectors, such as industry, manufacturing. But at the same time, Japan receives a lot of foreign direct investment and begins expanding its manufacturing sector to include producing automobiles and different parts and components for larger items. As I mentioned, automobiles are a big one. Eventually, you'll start to see a rise in computer chip manufacturing and whatnot in order to power personalized computers. But in the 60s to the present, you'll really see Japan begin to globalize, begin to continue to integrate economically, which in turn catapults Japan into the forefront of economic growth and development to become a global economic power. So this is a quick overview of the winners and losers in both America and Japan as a result of this compressed modernity. And as you can see, primarily, well, at least in America, primarily white, educated, wealthy, white-collar suburbanites tend to be the winners of compressed modernity because they were able to leave the cities, take their tax dollars with them, start and develop wealthier communities, which will eventually keep the money flowing within the communities and allow these communities to grow and be self-sufficient while the cities continue to experience urban decay. And this is where we actually see the losers of compressed modernity in America, mostly uneducated minority groups who were poor, blue-collar workers and were living in urban areas. Once the money left and the economic opportunity left, there's really nothing for these urbanites to do. There was no, as I said, no opportunities for them as a result of this compressed modernity. We see a similar situation in Japan, where a lot of educated men, service-based workers, upper-class people, and industrialists were really the winners of this compressed economic modernity, whereas the losers were women, miners, peasants, farmers, and lower-class people, because Japan's economic shift from an agricultural economy to really a service-based manufacturing outsourcing economy, put farmers and peasants and miners, they were the losers because their occupations essentially shrank as Japan continued to shift economically. And there were less opportunities for these kinds of people as opposed to the winners of this modernization. So as I mentioned before, the losers of compressed economic modernity in America were mostly minorities who were poor, uneducated, and were living in the inner cities. And then this is where we really see gang culture start. So gang culture really begins in Los Angeles, California, in the 1960s and the 1970s. Really began, well, African-American gang culture, I should say. And one of the reasons is because African-Americans, they felt exclusion due to segregation. So African-Americans weren't allowed to join the Boy Scouts or other traditional forms of community due to the color of their skin. In addition, the failure of the civil rights movement in combination with the death of the Black Panther movement were catalysts for gang culture, because the whole purpose of the civil rights movement was to be able to allow African Americans to fully become equal, not just free from slavery and still subject to segregation and discrimination, but really to make everybody equal. And unfortunately, that did not happen in the civil rights movement. You have the violent assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And also you have the violent assassination of Huey P. Newton on UCLA's campus. And Huey P. Newton was a leader of the Black Panther movement. So once you have the failure of your civil rights movement and the failure of the Black Panther movement, what do? You know, there's nobody leading these youth who are attempting to make a change, and then it kind of just inspires chaos. And out of this chaos and out of the desire to continue to protect local neighborhoods from crime and police brutality is really where you see the beginning of gang culture in America. Now we're going to shift gears and look at gang culture in Japan, the origins of the Yakuza. So Yakuza essentially derived from two lower social classifications, which emerged in the mid-Edo period. The Tekkaya, who were individuals who primarily peddled illicit, stolen, or shoddy goods in the marketplace, and Bakuto, and those who were involved in or participated in gambling. Tekkaya and Bakuto were the two lower classifications of people that would eventually get together in order to start forming Yakuza organizations. And that's exactly what happened once these two groups combined their forces together. Their purpose, and the Yakuza's purpose initially, was to be able to extort customers in local markets by selling fake or shoddy goods. And the reason for this is because these local groups needed to be able to make money to support themselves and their families. Because the Yakuza organizations, they're really family-based. And again, it shows that even though Japan's compressed economic modernity produced a lot of winners, you still have lower class people who were left out of this compressed economic modernization. And then when they're left out of this compressed modernity, they don't have any choice but to pull their resources together in order to benefit somehow, in order to not feel excluded. And that's exactly what these Yakuza did. And in addition, you'll notice that Kyushu Island is the largest source of Yakuza members. And although you cannot see it on this picture I have here, this island is the closest point in Japan to Korea. And a lot of Yakuza members are actually Korean immigrants who also felt disenfranchised and who were also left out of this compressed economic modernization. They could be in the same classification as the Tekkaya or the Bakuto, in the sense that they were left out of this modernization and had felt oppressed or disenfranchised. And again, that is why Kyushu Island is the largest source of Yakuza members, because it is the closest source. It is the closest point to Korea, which is where a lot of Korean immigrants come to. They come to Kyushu Island in order to continue immigrating into Japan. Now, if we hop back to present day African-American gang culture, we'll see that gangs really function as a revenue generating business. So there's a lot of different businesses that illegal businesses that gangs dabble in. So you'll have your overall gang, and then you'll have your gang broken into different subsections called sets. And each set is responsible for different money-making schemes or money-making opportunities. So some of these revenue-generating operations include drug and weapon trafficking, illegal gambling, prostitution, money laundering, credit card fraud, things like this, in order to be able to help generate revenue for the family. And I use that word family And that is the second function of gangs, is that they essentially function as a family, because people join gangs, African-American gangs, in order to feel a sense of belonging, because more often than not, gang members come from broken homes, single family homes where there's little supervision, and usually at times in their teens when they really need adult guidance and it's not there for them, the only option they have is to go to the guys on the corner who they're seeing every day, who are looking out for them, who are making money, who seem to have it figured out. So they really want to be able to have that sense of belonging. But they also join gangs due to cultural similarities, common enemies, desires for respect and power. And again, it's really all about pooling resources together that were not provided by either the traditional economic sense or the modern economic sense. So these guys want to be able to pool their resources together, create a sense of belonging, and be able to essentially participate in the modernity, the economic modernity that they were left out of. And here's a snapshot of present day Yakuza culture. So I keep harping on the word family, but that's really important to understanding gang culture in America and Japanese gang culture. So the Yakuza, they use a family hierarchy structure known as Oyabun Koban, where Oyabun literally meaning foster parent and Koban meaning foster child. And here you'll see in this image of the hierarchy that the Oyabun is the family boss. And then you see the different rankings for first lieutenant, second lieutenant, administration. Then you'll see under Wakagashira and Shate Gashira, first lieutenant and second lieutenant respectively, or the Kyodai, the big brothers, and underneath them, the Shatai, the little brothers, which really, again, reinforces this idea that the Yakuza are a family structure. And again, similar to African-American gang culture, the primary purpose is to generate revenue for this family. And Yakuza, they engage in other similar illicit activities such as money laundering, drug and weapon trafficking, prostitution, and gambling. And again, family. Why do people join the Yakuza? Family. More often than not, Yakuza members, you'll hear the fairy tale story of the Yakuza taking in the orphaned boy and helping him find stability and comfort and become a man or whatnot. And of course, as far-fetched as this sounds, that's more often than not the case, where disenfranchised groups or individuals coming from broken homes don't have that sense of guidance or leadership and almost feel left out. And because of that exclusion, want to be able to find a place that they can call home, find people that they can connect with that'll always have their back. And out of this desire for a family and, seeing the Yakuza members and seeing that, they're powerful, they're well respected, really encourages these gang members, these individuals to join gangs and join the Yakuza in order to have a sense of inclusion, because they had always felt excluded, whether it was from the economic tradition, the economic modernity, feeling excluded in their own home. Joining the Yakuza allowed these individuals to really be a part of a family and be a part of something bigger. So what does all this say? Does this mean that gang culture is an invented tradition? I'm going to say no. I don't think that gang culture is an invented tradition, although it was created in response to some challenging circumstances resulting from a lack of tradition and a strong presence of economic modernity. So the primary reason why I'd say gang culture is not an invented tradition is because it does not fit the definition of an invented tradition. There's no suitable historical past that gang culture attempts to replicate. And essentially, I think that gang culture was created pretty much due to exclusion, people who were left out of their own families, people who were left out of the compressed economic modernization, people who were left out of the traditional economy. Like they They didn't have a choice because they didn't fit in anywhere. So they could only fit in with each other, and they really didn't have a choice but to pull their resources together and be able to try to create something almost out of nothing. And although gang culture, I don't think is an invented tradition, I'm concluding it's not an invented tradition. It does represent the lack of choices resulting from modernity or compressed modernity. So maybe it's not technically an invented tradition, but tradition and modernity do have a role in the creation of gang culture. So what does this say about tradition and modernity? It says that exclusion from tradition and modernity reduces the choices available for individuals. And in order to feel inclusion, they must create their own sense of tradition and modernity. As we've seen in African Americans in the United States, their tradition began as property. They were kidnapped from their land, brought to the United States of America, well, brought to the Caribbean or the West Indies at the time, then brought to the United States, were auctioned and sold and traded like property. And then once they were freed by the 13th Amendment, they were still this compressed modernity of freedom. Jim Crow laws were created as invented traditions in response to this compressed modernization of African Americans, and they were continuing to feel left out. They were discriminated against. They were segregated against white people. And even in the civil rights movement, it failed. Their leaders were violently killed. And as the country continued to grow and continued to modernize, African Americans were still left out. So they weren't a part of the tradition. They weren't a part of the modernity. So what choice do they have? They have to come together because they all have a common enemy. They all have a desire for more than what has been given to them. And they don't have a choice but to create gangs. And we really see that in Japan as well, with the Tekkia and the Bakotu being left out of the compressed economic modernization. These lower class people, Korean immigrants coming to Japan for a better life, being left out. These three groups can really come together, pull their resources in order to create something where they can feel included, something that doesn't just leave them behind. They didn't fit in with the economic tradition, did not fit in with the economic modernity. You don't have a choice but to come together and try to create something for yourself. And that's really what we see with gang culture, is that gang culture isn't an invented tradition in response to economic modernity. Gang culture is created in response to when tradition and modernity both fail an individual or a group of individuals. Thank you all very much for coming to my presentation this evening, Gang Culture, a Response to Compressed Economic Modernization. As we've concluded, gang culture is not an invented tradition, but rather a response to when tradition and modernity both fail. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.